A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, Herman, I was looking at your desk earlier and I saw about 4 different legal pads filled with flowcharts that look like something out of a conspiracy theorist's basement. I'm assuming this has something to do with the prompt we got from Daniel.
It has everything to do with it, corn. Today's prompt from Daniel is about what money laundering is and how it actually works. And honestly, the deeper you go, the more you realize that the old metaphors of washing dirty cash in a literal laundromat are almost quaint compared to the modern reality. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, for anyone who forgot my last name over the weekend.
I do not think anyone could forget a name like Poppleberry, Herman. But let us get into this. Daniel is asking a fundamental question, but it feels like one of those things where everyone thinks they know what it is because they have seen a few episodes of Ozark or Breaking Bad. But if you actually handed me $10 million in cash right now, I would have no idea how to buy a house with it without getting a very unpleasant visit from the Internal Revenue Service.
That is the core paradox of the digital age. We live in an era where money is increasingly just data, yet having a massive amount of that data is completely useless if you cannot prove where it came from. If you show up to buy a yacht or a penthouse in Manhattan with a suitcase of cash, or even a mysterious digital wallet containing 1,000 Bitcoin, the legal gates slam shut. Money laundering is not really about cleaning money in the sense of making it look nice. It is about data obfuscation. It is the process of creating a legitimate-looking history for wealth that was acquired through illicit means.
So, it is essentially a creative writing exercise for accountants. You are trying to write a backstory for your money that the bank will actually believe.
That is a great way to put it. The goal is to detach the funds from their original criminal source and weave them into the legitimate financial system so seamlessly that they can be used without triggering an alarm. Historically, we have talked about this in 3 stages. There is placement, which is getting the cash into the system. There is layering, which is moving it around to hide the trail. And finally, there is integration, where the money comes back to you as clean, spendable wealth. But in 2026, those lines are blurring because of how fast the technology moves.
Let us talk about that first step, placement, because that seems like the hardest part. If I am a drug runner or a cybercriminal, and I have piles of cash or untracked digital assets, how do I even get that into a bank without the teller hitting a silent alarm?
The classic method is something called smurfing or structuring. In the United States, banks are required to report any cash transaction over $10,000. So, a launderer hires a bunch of people, the Smurfs, to go around to dozens of different banks and deposit $9,000 at a time. But the authorities caught on to that decades ago. Today, digital smurfing is much more sophisticated. We are seeing automated microtransactions where algorithms move tiny amounts of value across thousands of accounts in seconds. It is high-frequency placement.
And I imagine the banks are trying to use their own AI to catch those patterns. But it is a cat-and-mouse game. If you are moving $5 at a time across 1 million accounts, how does a computer distinguish that from legitimate retail activity?
It is incredibly difficult. The Financial Action Task Force, which is the global watchdog for this stuff, estimates that between 2 and 5% of global gross domestic product is laundered every single year. We are talking about trillions of dollars. One of the biggest vulnerabilities right now is something called correspondent banking. This is where a small, perhaps less regulated bank in a developing nation has an agreement with a major global bank in New York or London. The money enters the system at the weakest point, the small bank, and then hitches a ride into the global financial core through that correspondent relationship.
So the big banks are essentially outsourcing their trust to smaller institutions that might be easier to bribe or bypass. That feels like a massive hole in the plumbing. We actually talked about the hidden plumbing of the financial system back in episode 986, and it sounds like the launderers are just finding the rusted pipes that nobody's replaced yet.
They are experts at finding those rusted pipes. To understand correspondent banking, you have to understand nostro and vostro accounts. These are accounts that banks hold at other banks to facilitate international transfers. If a bank in a high-risk jurisdiction has a vostro account at a major New York bank, they can essentially funnel money through that account. The New York bank sees a single large transfer from a partner institution, but they might not see the 10,000 individual deposits that made up that transfer at the source. It is a massive blind spot.
And once the money is in that big bank, it is effectively in the bloodstream of the global economy. That brings us to the layering phase, which I know is where your flowcharts really start to get messy.
Layering is the most complex part of the process. This is where you use shell companies and nominee directors. A shell company is a business that exists only on paper. It has no employees, no office, and it produces nothing. You set up a web of these companies across different jurisdictions, like the Cayman Islands, Panama, or even certain states here in the United States that have high levels of corporate secrecy.
I have always found the nominee director thing fascinating. It is basically paying someone to put their name on the paperwork, so your name stays off it, right?
You might have a lawyer in a tropical hideaway who is the director of 500 different companies. He does not know what they do, and he does not care. He is just a legal shield. In the layering phase, the money is moved between these companies in the form of fake loans, consulting fees, or investments. You might have Company A in Cyprus loaning $5 million to Company B in the British Virgin Islands. Then Company B buys a painting from Company C in London. By the time the money has moved 5 or 6 times across borders, the original source is nearly impossible to trace.
And this is where trade-based money laundering comes in, which I know you have been reading about. This one feels particularly clever because it involves real goods.
Trade-based money laundering, or TBML, is probably the most effective method used today because it hides the movement of money under the movement of legitimate trade. Let us say you want to move $1 million of dirty money from one country to another. You have a company you control in country A ship, 1,000 cheap plastic chairs to a company you control in country B. But instead of invoicing them for $10 a chair, you invoice them for $1,000 a chair. Company B pays the $1 million invoice. On the surface, it looks like a normal business transaction. The money has moved legally, and you have a paper trail to show the bank.
It is brilliant in the dark way. Who is going to check the actual value of 1,000 chairs in a shipping container in the middle of a busy port like Haifa? The sheer volume of global trade makes it impossible to inspect everything.
That is the reality. Customs agents are looking for drugs or weapons, not necessarily checking if the price of a chair matches the invoice. We also see under-invoicing, where goods are shipped at a fraction of their value, allowing the recipient to sell them at market price and keep the difference as clean profit. Or even phantom shipping, where invoices are generated for goods that never even existed. It is a multi-billion-dollar hole in the global regulatory framework.
So we have placement, where we get the money in. We have layering, where we move it around until the trail is cold. Now we get to integration. This is the part where the criminal actually gets to enjoy the fruits of their labor, right?
This is the moment of triumph. This is when you take that layered money and buy something tangible and legitimate. Often this is high-end real estate, which explains why there are so many empty luxury apartments in cities like Miami, London, or Tel Aviv. They are not homes, they are just safe deposit boxes made of glass and steel.
It has a massive second-order effect on the economy. When illicit money floods the real estate market, it drives up prices for everyone else. It distorts the market because the buyer does not care if they are overpaying. In fact, overpaying can sometimes be the point.
If you buy a property for $10 million and sell it a year later for $9 million, you have lost 10%, but you have successfully laundered $9 million into clean, documented capital. To a criminal, a 10% loss is just the cost of doing business. It is a tax they are willing to pay to the legitimate world. But real estate is not the only game in town. We are seeing integration through the art market, casinos, and even tech startups.
Wait, tech startups? How does that work? Are you telling me the next big app I download might be a front for a cartel?
Not necessarily a front, but a vehicle. Think about how venture capital works. It is often opaque. A shell company can invest $5 million into a promising startup. If that startup gets acquired or goes public, that $5 million turns into clean, legitimate equity. The startup founders might have no idea where the original investment came from. They just see a check from a venture capital firm that is actually just a front for a layering operation.
And casinos have always been the classic example. The Vancouver model is something I have heard you mention before.
The Vancouver model was a specific strategy where criminals would bring bags of cash into a casino, buy chips, play a few low-stakes games, and then cash out with a casino check. That check is as good as gold to a bank. It is legitimate gambling winnings. While casinos have tightened their rules, the model has evolved. Now we see high roller junkets where the money is moved across borders through credit lines provided by the casino itself, bypassing the banking system entirely.
Now, I want to touch on the digital side of this. We hear a lot about how crypto is the preferred tool for criminals, but you have told me before that fiat wire transfers are still the king. Is that still true in 2026?
It is, though the landscape is shifting. The misconception that Bitcoin is the primary tool for laundering persists because it is new and sounds scary, but Bitcoin has a public ledger. If you are a sophisticated criminal, a public ledger is the last thing you want. Most major laundering still happens through the traditional banking system because the sheer volume of fiat currency provides better cover. However, we are seeing a rise in the use of decentralized finance, or DeFi, liquidity pools.
Explain that, because that sounds like the modern version of the Cypress loan trick.
In a DeFi pool, you can swap one digital asset for another without a centralized intermediary. You can use something called a mixer or a tumbler, which takes your digital coins, mixes them with thousands of other people's coins, and spits out different coins to a new address. It is like a digital shredder for your financial history. However, the regulatory environment is catching up. In January of 2026, the European Union updated its 7th Anti-Money Laundering Directive. It now requires crypto asset service providers to collect much more detailed information on both the sender and the receiver of any transaction, no matter how small.
So the walls are closing in on the Wild West of crypto. But that brings up a point we often discuss. All of this regulation, these Know Your Customer or KYC rules, they create a massive amount of friction for normal people. If I want to open a simple investment account, I have to provide my life story, my tax ID, and sometimes even a utility bill. Does this actually stop the big players, or is it just a tax on the honest?
That is the million-dollar question. We did a whole episode on the secret history of KYC in episode 985, and the conclusion was that it is often a defensive measure for banks rather than a proactive measure for catching criminals. If a bank can show they followed all the KYC procedures, they are less likely to be fined billions when a scandal eventually breaks. But for a sophisticated criminal organization, KYC is just a hurdle to be cleared. They use stolen identities, deepfake technology to bypass video verification and corrupt insiders.
It feels like the system is designed to catch the sloppy criminals, while the ones who can afford the best tech and the best lawyers just sail through. And then you have things like the Global Ledger Transparency Initiative that launched earlier this year. Do you think that is going to change the game?
The Global Ledger Transparency Initiative, or GLTI, is an attempt to create a unified international database of ultimate beneficial ownership. The idea is to end the era of anonymous shell companies. If you own more than 25% of a company, your name goes in the registry, regardless of how many layers of offshore entities you hide behind. It is a noble goal, but the implementation is a nightmare. Some countries are jumping on board because they want to be seen as clean financial hubs, while others are dragging their feet because their entire economy is built on being a place where people can hide money.
It is a geopolitical struggle. If you are a small island nation and your only export is financial secrecy, you are not going to give that up just because the European Union asks nicely. But I want to pivot back to what this means for the average person. When Daniel asks how money laundering works, it is not just a curiosity. It affects the stability of our entire financial system. If the plumbing is full of dirty money, does that make the whole house less stable?
It absolutely does. It undermines the integrity of financial institutions. When a bank gets caught up in a laundering scandal, its stock price craters, it loses its ability to operate in certain markets, and it can even lead to a systemic crisis if the bank is large enough. But more importantly, it allows criminal enterprises to scale. A cartel that cannot launder its money is limited by how much cash it can physically hide. A cartel that can launder its money can buy political influence, legitimate businesses, and advanced technology. It turns a local problem into a global one.
It is the ultimate force multiplier for crime. If you can turn your illegal profits into political donations, you are no longer just a criminal, you are a stakeholder in society. And that is a terrifying thought. So, Herman, if we are looking at the future of this, where do we go from here? We have talked about the cat and mouse game, but is there a version of the world where we actually win?
I think we are moving towards something called programmable compliance. Imagine a world where the rules of the financial system are built directly into the protocol layer. Instead of a bank employee checking a transaction after the fact, the transaction itself cannot execute unless it meets certain cryptographic proofs of legitimacy. This would protect privacy because you would not have to share your whole life story with a human, but the system would mathematically know that the money did not come from a sanctioned address or a known criminal wallet.
That sounds like a double-edged sword. Total transparency and total compliance built into the code. It sounds efficient, but it also sounds like a nightmare for anyone who values financial privacy or who might be living under an oppressive regime that decides legitimate means whatever the government likes.
You have hit on the central tension of modern finance. How do we stop the bad guys without turning everyone's life into an open book for the state? Both of us tend toward a worldview that favors individual liberty and limited government interference. But when you see the scale of human trafficking or fentanyl distribution that is fueled by this money laundering infrastructure, it is hard to argue against better tools for enforcement. The challenge is ensuring those tools are used against actual criminals and not as a way to debank political dissidents or control the population.
That is always the rub, is it not? The same tools used to catch a money launderer in 2026 can be used to freeze the bank account of a protester. We have seen it happen. But let us bring this back to Daniel's prompt. We have covered the 3 stages: the role of shell companies, the impact of trade-based laundering, and the new digital frontiers. What is the one thing you want people to take away from this?
The most important takeaway is that money laundering is not a victimless crime. It is the engine that drives almost every other major crime in the world. When you see a news story about a massive corruption scandal or a new drug epidemic, remember that none of it would be possible on that scale without a sophisticated financial infrastructure that allows that money to move and hide. It is the dark mirror of the global economy.
It is the shadow plumbing. If people want to go deeper into the regulatory side, I really do recommend checking out episode 985 on the history of KYC. It gives a lot of context for why your bank asks you all those annoying questions, and for the more technical side of how money moves through these hidden channels, episode 986 is the one to listen to.
I also think it is worth mentioning that for the average listener, being aware of ultimate beneficial ownership is a practical skill. If you are investing in a new startup or a real estate project, ask who actually owns it. If the answer is a series of holding companies in 3 different countries, that is a red flag, even if everything else looks legitimate. Transparency is the best disinfectant, but as we have seen, the launderers are getting very good at wearing sunglasses.
They are indeed. Well, Herman, I think we have successfully navigated the murky waters of financial obfuscation for today. I hope that answers Daniel's prompt and gives everyone a better sense of why their bank is so obsessed with where their Christmas bonus came from.
I think we have covered the bases. It is a fascinating, if slightly depressing, field of study. But the technology that makes laundering easier also makes it easier to track if we have the political will to do it.
That is a big if, my brother. A very big if. We should wrap it up there. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Madal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and keep our research flowing. This has been My Weird Props.
If you are finding these deep dives useful, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify really does help us out. It helps other people find the show and keeps us motivated to keep digging into Daniel's weird prompts.
We will be back soon with another one. See you then.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts. prompts where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.